Hello and welcome to the Royal Society of Medicine. My name is Claire Bainton. I'm a clinical consultant in global public health and I'm Vice President at the Royal Society of Medicine. I'm delighted to be chairing our 9th episode of our climate change series, and today we're considering the wider agenda of planetary health. This is a vast topic, and so we're going to be examining this through the lens of the pandemic. To reflect the theme, in this episode, we will hear from individuals from across the world. In order to capture this array of different voices, it's been necessary to disable the Q&A live function because we are pre-recording. However, this approach allows us to benefit from live illustration to capture and reinforce the key ideas in this webinar. My particular thanks goes to our RSM's senior designer, James Nichols, for his artistic work and contribution to this webinar. To open this episode, we have a collage of thought leadership injections to share with you, and they represent contributions from around the world.
My name's Hugh Montgomery. I'm Professor of Intensive Care Medicine at UCL in London, where I also chair the Lancet Countdown on health and climate change. We face a planetary emergency which threatens the well-being and survival of ourselves and of our children, but potentially of our civilization and even maybe of our own species. And there is no time left to act. In the 540 million years since multi-celled life appeared on planet Earth, it took all of that time for the human species to appear and for our population on Earth to reach 1 billion, which it did in the early 1800s. Our population now, as a species, is more than 7.8 billion, approaching 8 billion. We will have added 1 billion people to the planet in the last 11 to 12 years by the time we reach 2023. And each of those people is using more and more resource. And that is related to mining, for instance, or use of fresh water, or use of topsoil. A lot of that water comes from fossil aquifers, which filled many millions of years ago, and once drained, will have gone. Topsoil loses around 1% of its mass with every time it's tilled. Once you've had 100 crop cycles, there is no topsoil left. We're running out of the very things upon which our survival depends. We're also polluting the planet. We're building, our species have been pervasive pretty much everywhere. This is destroying and depleting ecosystems, not just because of our presence, but because of overhunting and overfishing, and because of destruction of habitat and depletion of ecosystem complexity. Indeed, the number of vertebrates on the planet has fallen by nearly 70% since I was only 8 years old. We're now losing around 8 species an hour, becoming extinct. And you and I are living through the greatest mass extinction this planet has ever seen. We are thus greatly exceeding the planetary boundaries upon which we depend for our survival. We just have to look around us at what we're doing. We're chopping down around 1 soccer pitch area of rainforest every 2 seconds now around the world. These are the lungs of our planet. Climate change is acting as a force multiplier. We're adding colossal volumes of greenhouse gases to a very small atmosphere. And we can't just wait for that to sort itself out in its own time. Around 1/5 of the CO2 we add to the atmosphere now will still be cooking our planet in 33,000 years' time. And around 7% of the greenhouse gases in the form of CO2 we add today will still be cooking our planet in 100,000 years' time. So we all need to act now. We can't do marginal things, we can't do small things, we can't leave it to another generation to fix this problem. The time is now to become educated and informed and to take action. And this action has to be dramatic. Greenhouse gas emissions, CO2 certainly emissions, in the COVID pandemic year only dropped internationally right around 6.8%. And to begin with a fighting chance of keeping temperatures at some sort of survivable level in the shorter term, we need to be reducing our gas emissions, each of us, by around 8% every year. So there's your challenge. There's no time or debate now. We just have to act, one and all. Thank you for listening.
The COVID-19 pandemic shows us that planetary health offers new insights that wouldn't be apparent using a more traditional public health or environmental health lens. First, the pandemic is a really good example of the need to focus on upstream drivers of health. Even if we still don't have all the answers, planetary health helps us ask the right questions about how global environmental change may be linked with COVID-19. For example, how may have global environmental change contributed to the emergence of the novel SARS-CoV-2 virus or its distribution once it crossed over into humans through things like trade and travel? Or how might global pollution alter host defenses, increasing the risk of infection or disease severity once infected? Second, the pandemic response highlighted where a planetary health approach can help avoid unintended consequences. For example, an estimated 3.4 billion single-use face masks are discarded daily as a result of the pandemic. While plastic-based PPE has played an important role in protecting people from infection, we have also generated an unimaginable amount of plastic waste, much of which is ending up in terrestrial and aquatic ecosystems. This has been a particular issue in places with poor solid waste management. Planetary health also pushes us to focus on solutions. For example, what are the strategies for minimizing waste, avoiding unnecessary disinfectants, and adopting the polluter pays principle? Third, the pandemic is an excellent example of interconnectedness and the need for systems approaches, which is at the heart of planetary health. What started as a health crisis quickly became an economic, education, and equity crisis, revealing the cracks and gaps in our systems of global governance. The case for planetary health as a valuable approach for protecting public health is even more obvious when we start to think about priorities beyond the COVID-19 pandemic and how we are going to tackle the other crises of climate change, biodiversity loss, and global pollution.
Hello, my name is Dr. Deoraj Kosi, and I would like to present to you an African perspective on climate change and health. Climate change doesn't occur in isolation. It is driven by the aggregate activity of human beings on the planet that result in greenhouse gases and avoided adverse effects. Unfortunately, the distribution of greenhouse gases and adverse effects are not uniform across the world. For example, in the African continent, we're the most vulnerable to the climate change adverse effects, and yet we're the least producer of greenhouse gases. Now, we are unable to cope with it because we don't have the infrastructure, the human or the financial resources. Now, climate change will touch many aspects of our life. We know the air we breathe, the water we drink, the food we eat, all interconnect all of us. But these are unfortunately affected by climate change. Climate change affects in one part of the world will affect another part of the world by the interconnection. Therefore, we need to have a multidimensional ecological approach where we take the world as one planet and the pollutants are distributed all across the world and the adverse effects will have an impact. Now, we know the impact of adverse effects have spillover effects in many sectors and many parts of the ecology. For instance, we know any part we take, whether it be a rise in temperature, a rise in ocean level, or distribution of vectors across, a change in shift pattern of agriculture, they will all lead to the same end result. They will lead to a vicious cycle of loss of life and livelihood, of disease, loss of income, and increases the social inequity. And therefore, when we address climate change, we have to have the multidimensional socio-political, ethical, economic aspects so we can address it in a holistic manner. Now, climate change would not be contained within one nation or one region. We need a global alliance to share good practices, to transfer technology that works and sustain them, such as solar power and wind harnessing. I thank you for your interest.
My name is Melvino Tiano from Kenya. I'm currently the Planetary Health Alliance Next Generation Fellow and also the founder of Planetary Health Eastern Africa Regional Hub and an associate team member of Women Leaders for Planetary Health. My insight about the health emergency of climate change is that the episodes of disruption resulting from climate change related events have led to disruptions of lives of highly vulnerable persons. And recently here in Kenya, there are occurrences of flooding of the Rift Valley lakes, for example, Lake Bogoria and Lake Nakuru, and also the swelling of Lake Victoria, which have resulted in sudden movements of poor community members into crowded temporary settlements. These lack essential services, including health, and poses serious challenges on COVID-19 control. So the needs for basics for life survival supersedes measures to control the current pandemic. And moreover, the members of the affected community that get infected with the disease have very low chances of survival because they are dealing with many problems in addition to lack of resources. Therefore, in my opinion, I urge the healthcare professionals to focus a lot more on preventive measures of transmission of viral pandemics that include Zika, Ebola, and also the current COVID-19 more than ever. As Planetary Health Concepts examines the link between human health and also the environment to prevent these pandemics. They can also engage in climate policy and action by acting as stewards of health-related mitigations. Thank you so much.
The COVID-19 pandemic highlights the need for a comprehensive approach to human health, maintaining and strengthening planetary health for improvements in environmental quality is an essential part of that. Exposure to indoor and outdoor air pollution makes individuals more vulnerable to COVID-19. Water access, good water quality, and biodiversity protection are key to battling the spread of pandemics. In addition, effective waste management is essential to minimize possible impacts upon health and the environment. The pandemic, and especially the associated lockdowns, also have long-term effects on the environment. In 2020, as economic activity collapsed, global emissions related to energy use, including carbon dioxide and some major air pollutants, dropped by around 7%, and demand for construction materials even more, while environmental pressures related to agriculture stayed much closer to the pre-COVID levels. But pollution levels are already picking up again. And as economies recover, growth rates of emissions, materials use, land use change will all come back to these pre-COVID levels. But there may yet be long-term environmental changes, as some sectors and regions are expected to only recover very slowly. And changes in the structure of the economy induced by the crisis can also lead to lower pollution levels. Although the effect is rather small, with, for example, greenhouse gas emissions remaining a few percent below what we had projected before the pandemic. The COVID-19 crisis has clearly demonstrated that societies need to strengthen their resilience to pandemics and other emergencies. We need to step up investment in environmentally friendly technology and make sure that COVID recovery packages are used to smoothen the transition to a low-carbon, resource-efficient economy, rather than these posing a barrier to transformation. Enhancing the environmental health of societies is key to a sustainable future.
Hi, my name is Sabine Graf. I am a medical doctor and epidemiologist and a professor for climate change and health at Charité in Berlin. And I'm heading the research department for climate resilience at the Potsdam Institute for Climate Impact Research. So what can we learn from the corona crisis for the climate crisis? What are parallels? In both, we're dealing with an emergency that is high risk and high urgency. Risk is the magnitude of the potential damage multiplied by the probability of it happening. And urgency means the time to avert the damage is tight. For both corona and the climate, the damage comes with some delay in time. So infections of today become intensive care patients weeks later. Greenhouse gases emitted today influence the climate decades down the line. So if we only react once we clearly see the damage in front of our eyes, it is too late. Because there is also a minimum reaction time of societies. For COVID, that was to get testing, case tracing, etc. in place. And for the climate, it means building a renewable energy system, changing our transport system, our food system, etc. And all of that takes time. So how far are we from the iceberg in relation to how long our ship takes to change course? And the iceberg meaning the health system being overwhelmed by COVID cases or catastrophic climate change impacts. When that time span we have is barely more than the reaction time needed, then urgent action is required, no matter if the time scale is weeks or years. And we're clearly in a climate emergency. The risk of damage is huge and time to react is running out. So we need to act before it is too late. Now, besides the emergency link, there are also links in the underlying drivers. COVID-19 and climate change are both symptoms of a deep planetary crisis, alongside biodiversity loss and pollution. All of that has to do with our exploitation of nature. For COVID, the destruction of wild habitats and wildlife trade, making virus spillover events more likely. UN General Secretary Guterres called it our war on nature, which we cannot win, of course, as we are a part of nature, one component of that highly complex web of life forming our wonderful living planet. But we don't realize our value system is totally human-centered, excluding all other living beings. We believe we're the only species that matters on this planet, and all others are just here for us, a pile of resources to exploit at our whim, which we do at exponential speed. And now we're surprised that our abuse of nature is backlashing on human health. Of course, not all humans are equally part of this game. There are also huge injustices between humans in terms of the benefits reaped and the harms suffered. As a society, we clearly need to set up better rules to protect our global commons, the forests, the oceans, the atmosphere, and our health, against short-term profit interests. And we need a better ethical compass, a different attitudes to guide our actions, based on an understanding of connectedness with each other and all non-human life sharing this planet. COVID-19 reminded us how vulnerable we are and how interlinked. And maybe this can be a wake-up call to change the exploitative relationship with nature and with each other. Maybe we can emerge from the emergency in a way that makes us healthier and happier, more humble and more connected.
My thanks goes to all of our contributors for their rich collage of thought leadership injections. And now I would like to welcome our distinguished panel members. Professor Dame Anne Johnson is President of the Academy of Medical Sciences, Professor of Infectious Diseases at University College London, and co-director of UCL's Health of the Public, as well as having led many other roles within our major funders. Welcome, Anne.
Thank you. Good to be here.
Thank you. Dr. Chris Murray is an Associate Professor in Environment and Health, and he is based in the Gambia. As well as heading the Ecological Health Lab in the School of Public Health, Imperial College, Chris leads the Planetary Health Arm and theme at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine in the Medical Research Unit in the Gambia. Welcome, Chris.
Thanks a lot. Really pleased to be here.
Penina Mirage, known as Penny, is from Kenya. She is co-deputy director of the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine's Centre on Climate Change and Planetary Health, and has worked in public health policy and with Public Health England and with the UK Department of Health. She is an environmental epidemiologist, and she is focused on developing multidisciplinary approaches to manage the complex interdependencies between health and ecosystems in order to achieve sustainable development. Welcome, Penny.
Thank you very much, Claire.
And we have Dr. John Amoasi, who co-chairs the Lancet One Health Commission. John is based in Ghana at the Global Health Department at the School of Public Health, and he is head of Department of Community Health at the School of Medicine and Dentistry. John serves as an executive committee member of the African Coalition for Epidemic Research, Response and Training. and is coordinating research on the clinical characteristics of COVID-19 on the African continent. You're very welcome, John. So to open up, I would like to come to you first, Penny. As Co-Deputy Director of LSHTM's Centre on Climate Change and Planetary Health, would you kindly outline how climate and planetary health interact?
Yes, thank you, Claire, and hello and welcome everybody. I think we all have a fairly good understanding of what we mean by climate change. But if I can borrow from the Meteorological Office definition, climate change refers to a large-scale, long-term shift in the planet's weather patterns and average temperatures. And now we have very good evidence that humans have contributed to this shift through the release of carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases into the air, which causes global temperatures to rise, resulting to long-term changes in the climate. So typically what happens when we burn fossil fuels, so coal, oil, and gas for energy and our consumption, we end up releasing greenhouse gases. And over time, these gases accumulate in the atmosphere and they form what we can think of a blanket around the planet, trapping heat from the sun and causing the earth to warm up, hence climate change and global warming. Now, planetary health is a newer concept to many, but it's very closely linked to climate change. And it's really based on the understanding that human health, the health of our civilizations, our survival, and the earth really, depends on flourishing natural systems and the wise stewardship or the sustainable management, if you like, of those natural systems. And this stems from a realization that our exploitation and our use of natural sources has benefited human beings with huge benefits to health, and in particular, improvements in life expectancy, so we are living longer and longer, but also in terms of increases in affluence, so reduction in poverty, and this is globally. But this has happened at the expense of natural systems. So now we know that there's an unprecedented loss of natural systems that support life on Earth. And some of this work is has been summarized by a seminal report by the Rockefeller Foundation and the Lancet Commission. It came up in 2015, and it's titled Safeguarding Human Health in the Anthropocene Epoch. And some of my colleagues at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicines were co-authors on that report. But if we think of this natural system, we often depict them using a planetary boundary framework, as you can see on that image. You'll have seen many variations of this image, but this is the one that was used in the Lancet Commission, the report that I just mentioned. And it was first initially developed by the Stockholm Resilience Center at Stockholm University. Now the framework summarizes natural systems that are vital to how the Earth functions and that we rely on for our survival. And it depicts 9 boundaries. And as you can see from that, climate change is one of those 9 boundaries. There are other boundaries. I won't go into details, but you can see that they're there. And another really important one is biosphere integrity. And this really looks at biodiversity and the loss of species extinctions. So in my definition of climate change, I try to capture how our reliance on fossil fuels and how our exploitation of natural resources has led to damaging the atmosphere. Now, some of the key points I want to touch on looking at these planetary health boundaries are, the first one is that it's a really good attempt to summarize very complex systems. There's of course some overlaps, but what it does is that it gives us a really good starting point in terms of focusing our research, but also policies. The second thing is looking at the traffic light color coding. And the authors of this particular work have called those zones as safe operating spaces. So the green zones depict areas that are safe, where we are operating below the boundaries. And the yellow zones are areas of increasing risk. And you can see that climate change is now deemed in the yellow zone. And the red areas depict areas of high risk, where we've gone beyond the safe operating space. And you can see with respect to genetic diversity and today's discussion, we are indeed in the red zones. The third point to make is that in research generally, but also specifically looking at climate change research and human health, there's been a lot of focus on climate change with very good reasons for that. But we need more discussions and more research on the other planetary health boundaries. And I want to thank Claire and her team in taking us beyond the climate change discussion in today's session. So that's all I have.
Thank you so much, Penny. And that is a wonderful introduction for our audience to understand how they interact. Can I come to you, John? The Lancet One Health Commission, which you co-chair, has the remit, and I quote here, "It is expected to offer a recalibrated understanding of the ways in which global health challenges are implicated within the complex interconnectedness between animals, humans, and our shared environment." And it also has a remit for solutions, and I quote, "It's to provide an approach for harnessing this knowledge to ensure a sustainably healthy future for all species and the planet we inhabit." John, could you please describe the focus areas of the Lancet One Health Commission, particularly those that do and those that don't link to the pandemic?
No, thank you very much for having me, Claire. I think we couldn't have had a better time to look at One Health than now when we're living through a pandemic. It's hard for me to talk about what may or may not link to the pandemic, because I think it really does link to the pandemic in every way, especially now that we know that this disease, COVID-19 or the SARS-CoV-2 virus, came to us through animals, most likely the horseshoe bat. It does indeed show the complex interrelationship that we have with our natural environment, which is actually a shared environment, something that we often forget, and which is why climate change, together with One Health, are perhaps one of the most important global considerations that we need to look at. But more specifically to the Lancet One Health Commission, which I co-chair with Professor Andrea Winkler, who's based in Norway in Oslo, and also with the Technical University of Munich. This Lancet One Health Commission, as you rightly mentioned, it's a multi-sectoral, interdisciplinary, we're looking at integrated approaches to health among humans, animals, plants, and what we call the abiotic resources of our shared ecosystems. And we aim to galvanize this by looking at a couple of things, including synthesizing evidence that's available and identifying knowledge gaps regarding the value of an integrated approach to the health of humans, animals, environments, plants, as I mentioned, and this ecosystem that we share. Because it's really important to understand this shared space and how an integrated approach really is profitable to all. It needs to be demonstrated empirically, although of course it does sound intuitive. But if it was always intuitive, then one would have argued, why One Health now? So we need to really demonstrate to governments and to other stakeholders, including to the community, that it is to our immediate and long-term profit to adopt these integrated approaches. And particularly looking at things like, of course, the environment that we share, safe food and food systems, shared medicines and interventions. And we emphasize particularly infectious diseases, antimicrobial resistance, non-communicable diseases as well are in there. And I know that the concept of non-communicable diseases has been a bit foreign to One Health, although the literature these days is slowly demonstrating how One Health really goes beyond just looking at zoonotic diseases. We're also looking at identifying stakeholders and motivating factors for their participation in this integrated approach towards the health of people, animals, and the shared environment. And then ultimately, we want to produce policy and investment recommendations for institutionalizing One Health approaches. including with respect to governance, to financing, and to implementation at different levels. I'm sure I'll have the opportunity to go more into what our commission hopes to achieve, but I'd like to stop here and say once again, thank you for having me.
John, that was wonderful and shows the task that you have ahead with both the detail and the evidence base, and then those vast political agendas and influences which are part of your goal with the Commission. We wish you all the best. Can I please now come to again welcoming Anne to our webinar. Dr. Richard Smith, Chair of the UK Health Alliance on Climate Change, wrote an open letter on the 27th of April to the BMJ. And he wrote it to you in your role as President of the Academy of Medical Sciences. In that he wrote, and I quote, "The pandemic has illustrated how we are part of nature, not its master, and how inequalities and injustice means that the disadvantaged suffer most." Can these issues be addressed through the Academy or perhaps through other avenues where you lead, Anne?
Thank you for a great challenge, and Richard's letter was very helpful and important, and actually aligns with much of the strategy which we have been working on in the Academy. And first to say that I'm President of the Academy of Medical Sciences, but I have a public health background, and so I understand that if we want to improve health, it's not sufficient to understand biology and basic mechanisms, important as they are of ill health, but we also need to understand much broader drivers of health and disease. And infectious diseases particularly, which is my specialist area in the pandemic, result from the interaction of the biology of organisms that are transmitted, the behaviour of populations and their biology, and critically the physical and socioeconomic environment, as well as our influences on them, which we've just heard about from Penny. And social determinants are critical not only to infectious diseases, but to non-communicable diseases as well. So the inequalities in our socioeconomic environments locally and globally are translated into inequalities in health all over the world. And academies, which are there are academies all over the world of science academies, have, I think, three important roles in this context. First of all is to be an independent and I hope trusted voice for research and evidence. Secondly, through that research and evidence, to be able to engage with and influence policymakers. And thirdly, to engage with the public in the understanding of science, something that many scientists have had to learn quite a lot about during the pandemic. It follows that if we want to influence health and health inequalities, as Richard says, the academies need to not only engage with these broader subject areas, but also to be a diverse academies in terms of disciplines, skills, geography, culture, and a range of characteristics. So examples of where our academy, the Academy of Medical Sciences, have worked in this area is through a report that we produced in 2016 called Improving the Health of the Public by 2040. This had a primarily UK lens, but it called for transdisciplinary research, which brought together the many disciplines, and that's part of the idea behind One Health, that we need to bring together to improve health and reduce inequalities. Population scientists, economists, lawyers, experts in the built and natural environment, alongside practitioners and policymakers if we want to make a difference. That in turn, that report, I believe, has altered the funding landscape for research in the UK. And we've seen new investment in prevention research programs in priorities for public health leaders, in developments in the UK, for example, for the School for Public Health Research and so on. And we've seen other funders, quite independently, but funders like the Wellcome Trust really are engaging now with the topic of climate change and their priorities. Back at the Academy, though, this year, we're working with the Royal Society and we'll be publishing a report ahead of the Climate Summit COP26 and the health code benefits of climate change mitigation work, which is being led by Andy Haynes at the Academy and Joanna Hay at the Royal Society, exploring health impacts of decarbonisation. Policies in a range of sectors includes energy, food, transport, the built environment and others. But all those sectors clearly relate all very closely to planetary health because they're all about the environments that we influence and which are influenced by climate change, but we in turn influence in different ways and will impact on our health. COVID has highlighted inequalities which have been evident for generations, and recent data shows that widening inequalities and a slowing in life expectancy improvements, as well as higher mortality and morbidity in disadvantaged groups, are actually from COVID. We have the evidence for these differences, but we need much better understanding now of how we can demonstrate that we can reduce inequalities, and then how we can implement those sort of interventions at scale. So what can universities do? I think many of the people, and indeed health practitioners, do in this space. I think there's a great deal that we can do in our lives, which we'll come to later. But also universities have a role, academies have a role to work not just in their own countries, but with partners internationally in these debates about planetary health. In our university, UCL, we published the first Lancet Commission on Climate Change and Health in 2009, and we've gone on to be involved in the climate change countdown since. I appreciate that's all about climate change, but there are many alignments with the topics of planetary health, which consider the broader impacts on the environment. And we've been investing in the School for the Health of the Public at UCL, which brings together all the disciplines across the university in environment, the built environment, as well as health and social science, to be able to think about these broader issues of the determinants of health. And if you look at last week, was the publication of the Climate Change Risk Assessment published by the UK Climate Change Committee, which also looks not only at mitigation, but adaptation to climate change. And if you look at their top 6 or 8 risks, which were demonstrated last week, you can see how much they interface with what's just been said about planetary health. Risks, for example, the viability and diversity of terrestrial and freshwater habitats on species from multiple hazards. Risks to soil health from increased flooding and drought. These all have impacts for the health of animals and humans. Risks to natural carbon stores, risk to crops and livestock and commercial trees from multiple hazards, all issues that relate, of course, to food systems and so on. Supply of foods and goods and vital services may also be disrupted, not just by climate change, but by broader environmental damage. And then, of course, there are risks to human health of overheating and well-being. And these are all areas where I think specialists in a whole range of disciplines need to come together to think about solutions. The NHS is now setting out its own net zero ambitions, as we also in our clinical practice, those of you who are health professionals who engage with this webinar, but across all our workplaces, we can think about how we can contribute to environmental sustainability and to net zero for the future, because there is so much we can do to address this broad issue of planetary health if we are to secure a healthier future for the human species, but for the many species that make up and environments that make up our planet. Thank you.
And that was wonderful. I mean, to hear the wonderful work that's going on and the rich tapestry, the leadership that's happening from these organizations and from yourself, bringing together the different disciplines, sectors, as well as global wide inclusion in that approach is really wonderful to hear. Thank you very much. Chris, can I come to you? In your Imperial College profile, you have described your interests as being about, and again, I quote for you, addressing problems that characterize the impacts of global change, those that could also be leveraged for mitigating human impacts and promoting better stewardship of the natural world. Chris, we'd love to hear your insights about the possibilities for global change, speaking in relation to the pandemic, for the benefit of planetary health.
Yeah, absolutely. And thanks so much for the invitation to contribute to this webinar. And also thanks to the previous 3 speakers, Penny, John, and Anne, for what was really just a beautiful series of eloquent summaries and overviews of various activities, and in many ways preempted a lot of the stuff that I was planning to introduce. So perhaps I'll talk a little bit more from a personal perspective so as to not repeat just the sort of overarching themes of our field here in planetary health. So I think starting from the beginning, in a sense, I kind of often think about my own sort of haphazard way of having ended up in this position, to have the privilege to be able to speak to this learned group of people, and it's you know, it's a real pleasure for me to think back of the first research projects that I was ever involved in on the sex lives of lizards in you know, in the desert in Australia, where, you know, not far from where I grew up, and thinking about, you know, life and biology and ecology and the interactions of species. And this really defined my character growing up and defined my trajectory scientifically and professionally. And so it might seem at first a little bit sort of unusual, or perhaps you know, dislocated in some way from the topics of climate change and you know, agriculture, ecosystem services, loss, and that kind of thing. But really, there is a fairly straight path here. It's about biology. It's about the functioning systems of the planets. It's about the interactions of all the species on the planets, what they do, their lives, how they go about to accumulate the resources, the things that keep them safe and that keep them healthy and happy. And in many respects, what I'm seeing with the unfolding of the field of planetary health is a similar reflection on the vulnerability of our own ecology as a species. Penny used the term the safe operating space, which is the phrase that was used in the original planetary boundaries kind of hypothesis. And that's, you know, sort of stolen from occupational health and safety language, where we have the right in some respects to be able to go to a workplace and, you know, not be killed you know, or injured for our efforts. And that's really what this whole field is coming to sort of define. The thing that's interesting is that the edges are fuzzy and very, very broad. So, I mean, I've been around, you know, since the beginning of, you know, the emergence of some of these themes, and seen the evolution of, for example, ecological health or ecosystem-based approaches to health into One Health, and ultimately now into planetary health. And the thing that really defines that shift is the influx of the medical voice into this whole area. I can play a little bit of the devil's advocate to say that perhaps the medical profession was a little bit tardy in coming to the table, in the sense that some of these issues have been on the table around environmental sustainability for a really, really long time. There's nothing fundamentally new about the planetary health agenda. It's very much the same agenda that biologists and people interested in conservation and sustainability have been, you know, kind of jumping up and down about for, you know, literally decades. But what is different is that stakeholder group is just so powerful. And what we're starting to see now is a real sort of galvanizing of energy and abilities to influence policy, to shape, you know, agendas, to shape the trajectories of societies. And I think that's where, coming back to this idea around the impacts of the pandemic, having precipitated so much of this stuff at a certain point of time, we now have this incredible opportunity to reflect on that precipitation and think about ways that we can emerge from this that finally starts to reflect the urgency of some of the actions that people have been proposing for quite a long time around decarbonisation, about preventing the ongoing loss of ecosystems and biodiversity, stewarding the biosphere, thinking about pollutants in a more holistic kind of a way, and really connecting the dots between nature and people. So I mean, I think it's been a devastating period in history, but I think the opportunity is here now. We have all the clues and all the bits of the puzzle and all the energy and all the motivations to be able to stick this stuff together and really emerge from this crisis in a much healthier way. And perhaps we can, you know, use some of this discussion to talk about some specifics around that. I'll leave it there at the risk of sort of droning on. But yeah, really pleased to be here, and thanks again for the invite.
Chris, it's really lovely to hear that personal story. You've really spoken from the human perspective about what really matters here, the interdependencies that we have. And really, I learned a lot about what your values are and what motivates you. And I hope it will inspire and motivate our audience as well. Thank you. At the UN General Assembly in March 2019, before the pandemic, the President said, "We are the last generation that can prevent irreparable damage to our planet." And he went on to stress that 11 years, and that was in 2019, 11 years are all that remain to avert catastrophe. Given this call to action, in this webinar, I would like to explore together themes about where we are now, recognizing the impacts of the pandemic, what lies ahead in terms of threats, and indeed, I hope we'll also focus on what the opportunities are, and importantly, what our audience can do in the planetary health arena. So I'd like to start by opening up a question to all of you as panel members. What have been the impacts of the pandemic in relation to climate change and planetary health? And thinking here, both positive and negative. Who would like to come in first?
Perhaps I can just start with what I think has been one of the clearest and perhaps the best documented large-scale environmental impact of the pandemic, and that's been the dramatic effect of lockdown on economic and in fact, behavioural activity of more or less the entire human race at a particular point in time. The benefits of that from the perspective of carbon emissions were rapidly assessed and really quite dramatic. So we saw immediate drops in carbon emissions from all of the activities that you imagine don't occur when everybody's stuck at home trying to stay away from each other. Emissions from the transport sector and industry, people not going to work, led to a reduction of somewhere between 7% in the first couple of months, going up to sort of a global average of around 17. So 17%. So 1/5 of the usual emissions were more or less, eliminated virtually overnight, and we haven't seen the kind of levels of carbon emissions that low for, as I understand, probably close to 2 decades. The downside of that is that despite the unbelievable impact that has had in a single year, the effect that the reduction in carbon emissions over the last 12 months or so is really insignificant in comparison to the cumulative CO2 emissions and other greenhouse gas emissions that we've contributed to the atmosphere over a much longer period. It represents probably around about, I think the calculations are around about 0.01 degree in reduced warming by the end of this century. And when you consider that the global average temperature increase is around about, I think it's around about 0.2 degrees per decade or so, and we've already gone above 1.1, 1.2 degrees globally averaged increased temperature since the Industrial Revolution, you can start to sort of piece together the scale of the task ahead of us in terms of trying to reduce emissions, even to meet the globally, the global agreement. Under the Paris Agreement, aiming towards limiting warming to within 2 degrees, what we've done through COVID has made very, very little contribution to hitting that target. Nevertheless, it's a huge opportunity to sort of see what is possible in terms of mobilizing the human population for a particular purpose, in this case, averting or trying to limit a global health catastrophe. And so there's been a huge amount of learning through that period about how to achieve these kinds of cuts. So I mentioned before, in the first couple of months, there was a reduction of about 7% in global CO2 emissions. That's roughly what we need to do as a globe every single year up until 2050 in order to meet the Paris Agreement. So it is really an unbelievable learning opportunity. And I'll just leave that as the first example to catalyze some conversation here.
Thank you so much, Chris. And those details and those figures are important to hear. Indeed, I think the pandemic has really been a proxy for what risks looks like for the future as well. Any other panel members like to comment on this question?
Can I just comment on how much the pandemic has highlighted inequalities? We've seen that in our own country, we've seen it in the UK, we've seen it across the world. And I think when we think about those inequalities, that makes us think very much about the drivers of those inequalities and the environments in which we live. You can see around the world where we've been very reliant until we have the vaccine on basically isolating from one another, which is an antithesis to what we are as human beings. We're social creatures, but it does highlight the impacts of the way we're living in overcrowded circumstances, in dense cities, in environments where ventilation is poor, air quality is poor, all the environments in which, of course, infectious diseases thrive. And that, I think, ought to make us reflect on the challenges for the future in improving environments for across the world to reduce health inequalities, but also improving environments that cut across not only what might be a good environment for human beings, good places to live, well-ventilated spaces, good quality, healthy food, sustainable food systems. But that must make us reflect on the broader planetary sustainable systems we need for a sustainable future. And you've seen all sorts of ways in which our behavior has been changing. We may see all sorts of demographic changes we haven't thought about. Just the fact we're sitting here remotely is something we wouldn't have done before to anything like the same extent. We're seeing patterns of remote working, at least for some sectors of the population, but that in turn may just increase inequalities. So thinking through whether there are new patterns of behavior which might actually be facilitative for our environments, we need to grasp what is good, but also be cautioned against, understand better what we've learned from this pandemic in improving the environments we live in for the future, taking in account all the other species we must live in harmony with.
Thank you, Anne. And actually, you've answered one of my questions about looking to the future. And I'd like to invite Penny in, whether she wants to comment on some of her solutions for the future on nature-based approaches or on other issues about the pandemic. Penny. Penny, you're on mute at the moment.
Yes, sorry about that. Yes. Yeah, I think I want to inject maybe a little bit of positivity, I guess, because there are some opportunities from the pandemic. And I think one of them is how it's forced us to re-examine and reassess our relationship with nature, whether you live in an urban area or in a rural setting. I think having access to those open spaces during the pandemic was almost seen as a lifeline. And just to refer you to some of the work that's happening at NHS England and DEFRA, who've now commissioned some work to looking at the role of social prescribing in managing chronic conditions. But just going back to some of the work that we are doing, looking at nature-based solution, it's something that really excites me a lot. So there's more and more work done now in linking up what we know about climate change and what we know about preserving biodiversity and protecting natural habitats. And this is because we now understand that these two concepts are linked, so they share the same drivers, but also they share the same solutions. So I get a little bit excited about nature-based solutions because this is an area of my interest, but also because I realize, and a lot of researchers now realize, the many benefits that come when we enhance nature. So some of those benefits include environmental benefits, such as carbon capture, but also societal benefits, including improving livelihoods and also promoting health. Now, just to give you a specific example of some of the work that I'm working alongside environmental conservation groups in East Africa. So those two specific groups that I'm working with advocate the use of natural regeneration techniques, specifically farmer-managed natural regeneration. And so this is where they work with local farmers to regenerate and restore degraded landscapes that have been degraded as a result of intensive agriculture. And so working with farmers to restore this landscape and intentionally integrating the restored trees and shrubs within croplands and grazelands has immediate benefits. Farmers have better crop yields, which as a result improves livelihoods, income. And the piece of research that we are trying to do now is trying to understand what those solutions have in terms of improving health, which is something that hasn't been done before. And it has a lot of potential and also really, really exciting.
Penny, thank you very much. And I think these are really important solutions. And whilst we're talking about solutions, I also think of the Dasgupta review about the economics of biodiversity, and recognizing what Anne said earlier, that we have to work across all sectors in order to make these changes. So when we're looking to the future, what are the strategies and solutions that we think are available to us? John, can I come to you?
Yes, please, Claire. Thank you very much. I think what my fellow panelists have mentioned are all very critical things to pay attention to, and actually do reflect the kinds of solutions that need to be brought to the table to address the issues of climate change and implications for pandemics and for planetary health, global health, whatever you want to call it. A couple of these, and you touched on this in your introduction to this question, which was the health economics issues. At the Lancet One Health Commission, we've called these sort of avenues to integrating One Health approaches as part of solutions to the risk or the threats that pandemics pose. And we recognize that the global economic system simply is unsustainable and will not lead us down a path which will be One Health friendly, and this need for radical change. Several people have proposed alternative global economic models, like from the Dasgupta review. We've heard of circular health. We've heard of the donut economy from Kate Rayworth, and then several others. So there are many options that have been put out there. What is clear is that there is need for a change. It is also clear that this change will not come or cannot come quickly, but it needs to be radical. So what that means is that we need to put in place the mechanisms to alter this huge, massive global economic system, which would prize a cut tree over a standing tree. A global economic system that would call a certain part of the world as economically poor or bankrupt. Meanwhile, if you were to translate those resources that they have available, which may be under the ground somewhere, in the ocean somewhere, or in a forest somewhere, if you were to quantify these in a different way, you'd have a different view of the economic strength or potential of that country. So I think just basically looking at global economic systems and the radical, slow change that needs to take place is one of these avenues. We're also looking at more integrated surveillance systems for human and animal health, just trying to identify or have in place systems that allow us to pick up signals and also to intervene as quickly as we can, not only for human health, but also for animal health. The surveillance systems we have currently are quite effective for human health, more or less in picking up things, not so much in the solutions that we need to put in place, and we can get better there. But also they need to do this at the animal level and to try and find a way of moving things forward. I think I will stop here. I had a few more points, but then we just stop.
John, that was wonderful. And indeed, you know, the economy is nature. Nature is our capital, and we need to take that on board. We are unfortunately out of time. And what I would love to have done is explored more about what our health professionals can do. We will share resources directly with our audience, and indeed the ideas and advocacy that you have given throughout this webinar is going to be critical for that work. I have a few announcements to make. Our next and final episode of this climate change series is on the 20th of July, and will focus on the role of healthcare professionals in the climate change discussion. And we can have a look at the impact and how they can advocate, particularly ahead of the COP26 in November. So more on the activities for our audience to do themselves in that episode. Returning to this webinar, we would be grateful if you could complete the survey to this episode. We appreciate your feedback, and indeed CPD points will be issued to those who complete the survey. So thank you. Our full resources page and a link to this recording of this webinar will be sent in the following up email to all that are members of our audience. And so finally, it is to thank you, Anne, John, Penny, Chris. We are so grateful for your time, for your insights, and for the work that you are doing to benefit all of us as a global community. I really mean that. This webinar has been fascinating to get a sense of what you are doing and what you're taking forward, and it is so important for us. Special thank you goes to Michael Rapp for his generous support, which enables the free access to this webinar for everyone across the globe. And with that, I say goodbye. Good afternoon, good evening, good night, good morning, wherever you are in the world. Take care.